When we think of British civilians during World War II, we picture the London Blitz, families huddled in underground stations while German bombs fell above. The defiant spirit of "keep calm and carry on" painted on propaganda posters. Winston Churchill's voice crackling over radio broadcasts, rallying a nation under siege. But here's what most people don't know, and what history books rarely tell you. Across the globe, scattered throughout an empire that spanned a quarter of the world's surface, British and Commonwealth civilians were facing their own desperate battles for survival. From the sun-baked limestone of Malta to the tropical humidity of Singapore, from the towering Rock of Gibraltar to the bustling streets of Hong Kong, ordinary people found themselves on the front lines of a global war. These weren't soldiers who had volunteered for combat. These were teachers and shopkeepers, civil servants and housewives, children and grandparents who had simply been living their lives when the world exploded around them. They were thousands of miles from the supposed safety of the British Isles, trapped in territories that became battlegrounds, facing bombing raids, occupation, starvation, and unimaginable hardship. The numbers are staggering. Over 400,000 British and Commonwealth civilians lived in overseas territories that came under direct attack during World War II. Tens of thousands died. Hundreds of thousands more endured years of bombing, siege, internment, and occupation. Yet their stories have been overshadowed by the heroism of the home front, relegated to footnotes in military histories that focus on battles and strategies rather than the human cost of global warfare. Today we're diving deep into these forgotten stories of Britain's other front lines. We'll explore how a tiny Mediterranean island endured more bombing per square mile than London. We'll witness the fall of supposedly impregnable fortresses and the courage of civilians who refused to surrender their humanity even in the darkest circumstances. We'll discover how communities scattered across the globe maintained hope, dignity, and resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. This is The Other Front Lines: Britain's air raids overseas and civilians abroad. Our first story takes us to a tiny speck of limestone in the Mediterranean Sea, Malta. Just 122 square miles of rock, smaller than the city of Philadelphia, but positioned at one of the most strategic locations on Earth. Sitting directly between Sicily and North Africa, Malta controlled the sea lanes that supplied Rommel's Afrika Korps and dominated the central Mediterranean. In 1940, Malta seemed almost peaceful. A quiet backwater of the British Empire, the island was home to 270,000 Maltese civilians who had lived under British rule for over a century. They spoke a unique language that blended Arabic, Italian, and English. They were devoutly Catholic, fiercely independent, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen to them. The British military presence was modest, about 3,000 personnel and their families, along with a small naval base and a handful of outdated aircraft. The island's defenses were laughably inadequate. A few coastal guns, some searchlights, and 3 obsolete Gloucester Gladiator biplanes that the locals had nicknamed Faith, Hope, and Charity. Then came June 11th, 1940. At 6:55 in the morning, Italian bombers appeared over Grand Harbour. The first bombs fell on the Royal Navy dockyard, sending columns of black smoke into the clear Mediterranean sky. It was the beginning of what would become one of the most intense and prolonged bombing campaigns in military history. What followed defied all logic and expectation. For the next 2.5 years, Malta endured over 3,000 air raid alerts. Think about that number for a moment. More than 3 alerts every single day for 30 months. The Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force dropped 6,700 tons of bombs on this tiny island. To put that in perspective, that's more bombs per square mile than fell on London during the entire Blitz. If Malta had been the size of London, it would have received over 400,000 tons of explosives. The bombing was relentless and systematic. The Germans and Italians weren't just trying to destroy military targets, they were attempting to break the will of the civilian population. They bombed hospitals and schools, churches and markets, residential areas and refugee shelters. They timed their raids to disrupt sleep, launching attacks at dawn and dusk when people were most vulnerable. The Maltese people responded in the only way they could. They went underground. The island's soft limestone was perfect for excavation, and soon families were carving shelters directly from the bedrock. These weren't simple caves, but elaborate underground communities complete with sleeping areas, kitchens, and even small chapels where people could pray. The Lascaris war rooms, originally built as British military headquarters, became a symbol of this underground existence. Carved 150 feet below Valletta, the complex housed not just military commanders, but hundreds of civilian families who had lost their homes to bombing. Children were born in these tunnels, couples were married by candlelight in underground chapels, an entire generation grew up in artificial caves, emerging only when the all-clear sirens sounded. Maria Borg was just 12 years old when the bombing began. Decades later, she could still recall every detail of those terrifying months. We lived like moles, scurrying from hole to hole. My mother would pack our belongings every morning, a few clothes, some food if we had any, my father's photograph, not knowing if our house would still be there when we returned. The sound of the Stukas diving, that screaming noise they made, it never left your head. Even in the deepest shelter, even in complete silence, you could still hear it echoing in your mind. The psychological warfare was deliberate and cruel. German Stuka dive bombers were equipped with sirens specifically designed to terrorize civilians. The sound was so distinctive and terrifying that people could identify the type of aircraft attacking them just by listening. Children learned to distinguish between the whistle of falling bombs and the scream of diving fighters. They developed a sixth sense for danger that no child should ever need. But the bombing was only part of Malta's agony. The island was under complete siege. Every supply convoy from Britain had to fight its way through German and Italian air and naval forces. Ships that left Gibraltar or Alexandria with food, fuel, and ammunition often arrived as burning wrecks, if they arrived at all. Food became so scarce that the daily bread ration fell to just 10 ounces per person, less than a single sandwich. Families survived on carob pods scraped from trees, prickly pear cactus, and soup made from boiled leather. Children developed rickets and scurvy. Adults wasted away to skeletal figures. Yet somehow the island held on. The situation became so desperate that by August 1942, Malta had only enough food for 2 weeks and fuel for 3 days. Operation Pedestal, a massive convoy of 14 merchant ships escorted by the largest British naval force assembled since Jutland, was launched as a last-ditch effort to save the island. The convoy faced 3 days of continuous attack. German and Italian aircraft launched over 700 sorties. Submarines stalked the ships through the Mediterranean. Only 5 vessels reached Malta, and they arrived as floating wrecks. The tanker Ohio, carrying precious aviation fuel, had her back broken by torpedo hits but was literally held together by destroyers lashed to her sides. She limped into Grand Harbor more dead than alive. Her deck awash, her engines silent, but still carrying the fuel that would keep Malta's fighters in the air. The courage displayed during these dark months was extraordinary. Civilians volunteered as stretcher bearers during raids, running through streets filled with falling bombs to rescue the wounded. Doctors performed surgery by candlelight in hospital basements while explosions shook dust from the ceiling. Teachers continued holding classes in underground shelters, using pieces of shrapnel as teaching aids to explain physics and mathematics. Perhaps most remarkably, the Maltese people never lost their sense of humor or community spirit. They organized concerts in bomb shelters, with musicians playing instruments salvaged from destroyed buildings. Children created games using bomb fragments as toys. Couples continued to fall in love and marry, even as their wedding ceremonies were interrupted by air raid sirens. The courage of Malta's civilians was so extraordinary that King George VI made an unprecedented decision. On April 15, 1942, he awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for gallantry, to the entire island of Malta. It was the only time in history that a collective award was made to an entire population. The citation read simply, "To honor her brave people, I award the George Cross to the island fortress of Malta to bear witness to a heroism and devotion that will long be famous in history." By the time the siege was finally lifted in late 1942, Malta had endured 154 days and nights of continuous bombing. Over 1,500 civilians had been killed and 4,000 wounded. Half the island's buildings had been destroyed or damaged, yet somehow impossibly, civilian morale had never broken. Children played games in bomb craters, that had become part of the landscape. Schools continued operating in underground chambers. Life, incredibly and defiantly, went on. The defense of Malta proved that civilian courage could be just as decisive as military strategy. The island's survival allowed Allied forces to continue attacking Axis supply lines to North Africa, contributing directly to Rommel's eventual defeat at El Alamein. But more than that, Malta demonstrated that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, could display heroism that matched any military unit. 6,000 miles east of Malta, another drama was unfolding that would shatter British confidence and reveal the vulnerability of even the most supposedly secure territories. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, was Britain's most important naval base in Asia and the cornerstone of imperial defense in the Pacific. In early 1942, Singapore seemed invincible. The island fortress boasted massive naval guns, modern airfields, and a garrison of 85,000 troops. More importantly, it was home to 550,000 civilians, a cosmopolitan mix of British expatriates, Chinese merchants, Malay fishermen, Indian laborers, and Eurasian families who had made the colony their home for generations. The British community in Singapore lived in a bubble of colonial privilege that seemed untouchable by the distant war in Europe. They attended garden parties at the cricket club, sent their children to exclusive schools, and employed armies of servants in their spacious bungalows. The men worked for trading companies, banks, and government departments. The women organized charity events and bridge tournaments. It was a life of tropical luxury that seemed as permanent as the monsoon rains. But this paradise had a fatal flaw that would prove catastrophic. Singapore's defenses were designed to repel a naval attack from the south. The massive 15-inch guns of the fortress pointed out to sea, not inland. The military planners had assumed that the dense jungles of Malaya provided an impenetrable barrier to land attack. They were catastrophically wrong. On December 8, 1941, just hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces launched their lightning assault on Malaya. What followed was a masterclass in military mobility and tactical innovation that shattered every assumption about jungle warfare. Japanese troops on bicycles raced down roads that British planners had dismissed as impassable. They used small boats to outflank defensive positions along rivers. They moved faster through the jungle than anyone thought possible. As news of the Japanese advance reached Singapore, the first cracks appeared in the colonial facade. Dorothy Nixon, a British nurse working at Singapore General Hospital, began keeping a diary that would provide one of the most vivid accounts of the colony's final weeks. Her entries reveal a community slowly awakening to the reality of their situation. December 15, 1941. The first refugees are arriving from upcountry, planters and their families who barely escaped with their lives. Mrs. Henderson from the rubber estate near Kuala Lumpur arrived this morning with her 3 children. She hasn't heard from her husband in 5 days. The children keep asking when they can go home. She doesn't know what to tell them. As Japanese forces swept down the Malay Peninsula with terrifying speed, panic began to grip Singapore's civilian population. The colonial government, desperate to maintain morale, continued to issue optimistic bulletins claiming that the situation was under control. But the evidence of impending disaster was everywhere. The bombing began on January 15, 1942. Japanese aircraft appeared over Singapore in broad daylight, meeting virtually no opposition from the handful of obsolete British fighters. They targeted not just military installations, but civilian areas, Chinatown, the Indian Quarter, residential suburbs where families had lived peacefully for decades. Dorothy Nixon's diary captures the horror of those first raids. The bombing has started in earnest. The hospital is overflowing with civilian casualties. A Chinese family was brought in this morning. Grandmother, mother, and 3 children. The grandmother had shielded the youngest child with her own body. Only the baby survived. We're running out of everything. Bandages, morphine, hope. The doctors are working 18-hour shifts, but there are so many wounded, so many dying. As Japanese forces closed in on the island, a desperate evacuation began. Ships of every description, passenger liners, cargo vessels, naval craft, even small pleasure boats were pressed into service to carry civilians to safety. The scenes at the docks were chaotic and heartbreaking. Families were separated in the crush. Children were put on ships without their parents. Husbands stayed behind while wives and children fled to an uncertain future. The evacuation ships faced a gauntlet of Japanese air and naval attacks. Many never reached their destinations. The SS Kuala, carrying 300 civilians, including many women and children, was bombed and sunk with heavy loss of life. The Empress of Asia, packed with 2,000 evacuees, was attacked by Japanese aircraft and set ablaze. Survivors spent days in lifeboats, watching Singapore's skyline disappear behind columns of smoke and flame. Margaret Dryburgh, a missionary teacher, was aboard one of the last evacuation ships to leave Singapore. Her account of the journey reveals the terror and uncertainty faced by those trying to escape. February 12th, we are packed like sardines below decks. The smell is indescribable. Fear, seasickness, unwashed bodies, and the lingering odor of the ship's cargo of rubber. The children are crying constantly. Their mothers try to comfort them, but what comfort can you give when you don't know if you'll see tomorrow? We can hear aircraft overhead, but we don't know if they're ours or theirs. Every sound makes us jump. On February 15th, 1942, the unthinkable happened. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable fortress, surrendered to Japanese forces. It was the largest surrender in British military history, and it sent shockwaves throughout the empire. For the 100,000 civilians who couldn't escape, a new nightmare was about to begin. The Japanese occupation of Singapore was brutal and systematic. British and Australian civilians were immediately rounded up and herded into internment camps. Changi Prison, originally built to house 600 inmates, now held over 3,000 civilian prisoners. Families were ruthlessly separated. Men, women, and children were crammed into different sections of the camp, often unable to see each other for months at a time. The conditions were deliberately designed to break the prisoner's spirit. Overcrowding was severe, with entire families forced to live in single cells. Food rations were kept below starvation level, a bowl of rice and thin vegetable soup twice a day. There was no privacy, no medical care, and no hope of release. Margot Turner, wife of a colonial administrator, managed to keep a secret diary throughout her internment, hiding the pages in her mattress and writing with pencil stubs and charcoal. Her entries provide a harrowing glimpse into daily life in the camps. March 1942. We sleep on concrete floors, with only a thin mat for comfort. The rats are so bold they run across us at night. Breakfast is rice water and a small piece of bread that's more sawdust than flour. The children are getting thinner every day. Little Susan asked me yesterday when Daddy is coming home. I didn't know what to say. I don't even know if he's still alive. But even in these horrific conditions, the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. Internees organized secret schools for the children, teaching them mathematics, history, and literature using textbooks created from memory. They staged clandestine plays and concerts with costumes made from scraps of cloth and instruments fashioned from tin cans and wood. They created a hidden library, copying books by hand when precious paper could be found. Dr. Cicely Williams, a pediatrician who had been working in Singapore when the Japanese invaded, became a leader in the women's camp. She organized medical care using herbs and traditional remedies, delivered babies under impossible conditions, and maintained detailed records of camp life that would later serve as crucial evidence of Japanese war crimes. The Japanese wanted to break us, she wrote years later. They wanted us to become animals, fighting each other for scraps of food. But we refused. We shared what little we had. We cared for each other's children. We maintained our dignity even when they tried to strip it away. That was our victory, not military, but human. The internees developed elaborate systems of communication and mutual support. They created a camp currency using cigarette papers and matchsticks. They established a black market for food and medicine, with guards sometimes participating in exchange for small luxuries. They organized entertainment committees that staged regular concerts and theatrical performances, providing crucial psychological relief from the grinding monotony of camp life. Children born in the camps grew up knowing no other world. They learned to speak Japanese before English, adapted to a diet of rice and vegetables, and played games that incorporated the realities of prison life. Yet somehow, their parents managed to give them education, values, and hope for a future beyond the barbed wire. The psychological impact of internment was profound and lasting. Many prisoners developed what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They suffered from nightmares, anxiety, and depression that persisted long after liberation. Relationships were strained to the breaking point. Some marriages survived the ordeal, others did not. When liberation finally came in September 1945, the survivors were shadows of their former selves. Many internees weighed less than 90 pounds. They suffered from malnutrition, tropical diseases, and psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Of the 100,000 civilians trapped in Singapore when it fell, thousands had died from disease, starvation, and execution. Yet those who survived had achieved something remarkable. They had maintained their humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. They had created communities of mutual support under the most adverse conditions. They had refused to surrender their dignity, their values, or their hope for the future. The fall of Singapore marked the end of an era, the collapse of the myth of European invincibility in Asia. But the courage of its civilian population during the dark years of occupation demonstrated that the human spirit could endure even the most brutal attempts to crush it. December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, as America was still reeling from the surprise assault, Japanese forces launched their coordinated attack on British territories across Asia. Hong Kong, the crown colony that had been British for exactly 100 years, was about to experience the most terrifying Christmas in its history. Hong Kong in 1941 was a bustling commercial hub, home to 1.6 million people, including about 16,000 British civilians. The colony had prospered as a gateway between China and the West, its harbour filled with merchant ships, its streets bustling with traders, bankers, and entrepreneurs from around the world. The British community lived comfortably in the mid-levels and on the peak, their lives a blend of Eastern exoticism and Western privilege. The colony's defences were modest, but seemed adequate for a territory that many considered a backwater. The garrison consisted of about 14,000 troops, British, Canadian, and Indian forces, along with local volunteers. The military planners believed that Hong Kong could hold out for several months if attacked, long enough for relief forces to arrive from Singapore or India. They were catastrophically wrong. The Japanese assault began at dawn on December 8th with a devastating air attack that destroyed most of Hong Kong's aircraft on the ground. Within hours, Japanese forces had crossed the border from mainland China and were advancing rapidly toward the colony's defensive positions. Emily Hahn, an American journalist who had been living in Hong Kong for several years, was having breakfast at the Hong Kong hotel when the first bombs fell. Her account of that morning captures the sudden transformation from peaceful colonial life to wartime terror. The sirens began at 8 in the morning and didn't stop. We could hear the planes overhead, a steady drone that seemed to fill the sky. Then came the explosions, not the distant rumble you might expect, but sharp, violent cracks that shook the building and rattled the windows. We huddled in the basement of the hotel, a mixed crowd of British businessmen, Chinese servants, American journalists, and European refugees who had already fled from the war in Europe. A Chinese woman next to me was clutching her baby, singing softly in Cantonese. I realized she was singing a lullaby, trying to keep her child calm, while the world exploded above us. The bombing was systematic and terrifying. Japanese aircraft targeted not just military installations but civilian areas. The crowded neighborhoods of Wan Chai and Central, the refugee camps that housed Chinese civilians fleeing the war on the mainland, the hospitals and schools that served the colony's diverse population. As Japanese ground forces advanced rapidly through the new territories, panic began to grip Hong Kong's civilian population. The colony's carefully maintained social order started to collapse. Wealthy British families who had lived in Hong Kong for generations suddenly found themselves refugees in their own territory, fleeing south toward Hong Kong Island with whatever possessions they could carry. The evacuation from the mainland was chaotic and heartbreaking. Families were separated in the confusion. Children became lost in the crowds of refugees streaming toward the ferry terminals. The harbor filled with overcrowded boats. Luxury yachts pressed into service as refugee transports. Fishing junks loaded far beyond their capacity. Sampans carrying entire families with their worldly possessions. Dr. Selwyn Clark, the colony's director of medical services, worked frantically to coordinate medical care for both military and civilian casualties. His diary, preserved in the Hong Kong archives, provides a clinical but deeply moving account of those desperate days. December 12th. The hospital is overwhelmed. We're treating wounded soldiers alongside civilian refugees, performing surgery by candlelight when the power fails. A shell hit the maternity ward this morning. 3 newborn babies were killed instantly, but their mothers survived. How do you explain that to a woman who has just given birth? How do you find words for such senseless tragedy? The British garrison fought with desperate courage, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. The Japanese forces, veterans of years of fighting in China, moved with precision and overwhelming force. They had studied Hong Kong's defenses carefully and knew exactly where to strike. On December 18th, Japanese forces crossed Victoria Harbour and landed on Hong Kong Island itself. The final phase of the battle had begun. For the 16,000 British civilians trapped on the island, there was nowhere left to run. The fighting on Hong Kong Island was brutal and close quarters. Japanese troops advanced through residential neighborhoods where British families had lived peacefully for decades. Civilians found themselves caught in the crossfire, hiding in basements and air raid shelters, while battles raged in the streets above. Barbara Anslow was just 16 years old. The daughter of a police inspector who had served in Hong Kong for over 20 years, her family's comfortable life in the mid-levels was shattered when Japanese shells began falling on their neighborhood. December 20th, we spent the night in the basement while the battle raged outside. We could hear machine gun fire in the street, shouting in Japanese, the sound of boots on the pavement above our heads. My mother kept us calm by reading from a book of poetry, her voice steady, even though her hands were shaking. My little brother asked if we were going to die. Mother said no, but I could see in her eyes that she wasn't sure. The end came on Christmas Day, 1941. After 18 days of fighting, Hong Kong surrendered. It was a Christmas that no one in the colony would ever forget. Not a day of celebration and joy, but of defeat, capture, and the beginning of nearly 4 years of brutal occupation. The surrender ceremony took place at the Peninsula Hotel in Kowloon. British officials, many of them wounded and exhausted, formally handed over the colony to Japanese commanders. For the first time since the Opium Wars, Hong Kong was no longer British territory. The immediate aftermath of surrender was chaotic and terrifying. Japanese soldiers, many of them drunk on victory and sake, rampaged through the colony. There were widespread reports of looting, rape, and murder. The carefully maintained order of colonial society collapsed completely. The 3,500 British and Allied civilians were rounded up and marched to Stanley internment camp on the southern tip of Hong Kong Island. The camp, built around a former prison and school, was designed to hold perhaps 600 people. It now housed nearly 6 times that number in conditions that were deliberately harsh and degrading. Families were crammed into single rooms that had once been classrooms or prison cells. Privacy disappeared entirely. Parents and children, husbands and wives, were forced to live in spaces barely large enough for one person. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Food rations were deliberately kept below starvation level. The Japanese wanted to break the internees' will to resist, to reduce them to a state where survival became their only concern. The daily ration consisted of a bowl of rice, some thin vegetable soup, and occasionally a small piece of fish or meat. It was barely enough to sustain life, let alone health. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of internment was watching children grow up behind barbed wire. These were kids who had been born into privilege, who had attended the best schools, who had been destined for comfortable lives in the colonial elite. Now they were learning to survive in conditions that would have challenged hardened prisoners. Barbara Anslow, the police inspector's daughter, later wrote about her teenage years in Stanley Camp. I spent my formative years behind barbed wire. I learned to speak Japanese before I learned to drive a car. I watched my father waste away from 180 pounds to barely 110. I saw my mother trade her wedding ring for a handful of rice to feed my younger brother. But somehow, incredibly, we created a community. We had schools where teachers used charcoal on scraps of paper to teach mathematics and literature. We had concerts where musicians played instruments made from tin cans and wood. We even had a camp newspaper written by hand and passed from room to room. We refused to let them destroy who we were. The internees organized an elaborate underground society within the camp. They established secret schools where children continued their education despite having no textbooks, no proper classrooms, and often no paper or pencils. Teachers created lessons from memory, teaching everything from Shakespeare to calculus using improvised materials. They organized cultural activities that provided crucial psychological relief from the grinding monotony of camp life. There were regular concerts featuring musicians who had managed to create instruments from scrap materials. They staged theatrical performances, with costumes made from rags and sets constructed from cardboard and wood scraps. They even created a camp library with books copied by hand when paper was available. The camp had its own economy, with cigarettes serving as currency and elaborate trading networks developing for food, medicine, and other necessities. Internees who had been wealthy businessmen found themselves bartering their last possessions for a handful of rice. Former servants sometimes had more resources than their previous employers, creating a complete inversion of the colonial social order. Medical care was primitive and often ineffective. Dr. Selwyn Clark, who had been interned along with the other civilians, worked tirelessly to treat diseases and injuries with virtually no medical supplies. He performed surgery using kitchen knives sterilized over candles. He delivered babies in conditions that would have been considered barbaric in peacetime. He watched people die from diseases that could have been easily treated with proper medicine. The psychological impact of internment was profound and lasting. Many internees developed severe depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. The constant hunger, the lack of privacy, the uncertainty about the future, and the complete powerlessness of their situation took a terrible toll on even the strongest personalities. Relationships were tested to the breaking point. Some marriages grew stronger under the pressure, with couples supporting each other through the darkest times. Others collapsed under the strain. Children sometimes blamed their parents for their situation, unable to understand why the adults couldn't protect them from the horror of their daily existence. Yet somehow the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. People fell in love in the camps, despite the impossible conditions. Couples were married in ceremonies that were both heartbreaking and beautiful. Vows exchanged in prison uniforms, rings made from scraps of wire, receptions consisting of shared portions of rice. Children adapted with the remarkable flexibility of youth. They created games that incorporated the realities of camp life. They learned to find joy in small things, a piece of fruit, a letter from the outside world, a successful performance in the camp theatre. They formed friendships that would last their entire lives, bonds forged in the crucible of shared suffering. The camp also became a place of remarkable cultural exchange. British, American, Dutch, and other European internees lived alongside each other in conditions that broke down many of the social barriers that had existed in peacetime colonial society. They shared food, stories, skills, and hope. They learned each other's languages and customs. In some ways, the camp became more truly international than Hong Kong had ever been in peacetime. When liberation finally came in August 1945, the survivors were almost unrecognizable. They had endured 44 months of captivity, malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma. Many were skeletal, weighing 40 or 50 pounds less than when they had been interned. They suffered from a variety of tropical diseases, malnutrition-related conditions, and psychological problems that would affect them for the rest of their lives, but they had survived. More than that, they had maintained their dignity, their humanity, and their sense of community under the most adverse conditions imaginable. They had refused to let their captors reduce them to mere animals fighting for survival. They had created schools, hospitals, theaters, and libraries behind barbed wire. They had fallen in love, raised children, and maintained hope for the future. The liberation of Stanley Camp was both joyful and heartbreaking. Families were reunited after years of separation, but many had been changed beyond recognition. Children had grown up without their parents. Spouses had aged decades in just a few years. Some internees had died just weeks before liberation, never knowing that freedom was so close. The experience of internment left lasting scars on all who endured it. Many survivors suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares about the camps for decades afterward. They hoarded food, unable to feel secure about their next meal. They struggled with relationships, having learned to be self-reliant in ways that made intimacy difficult. Yet they had also gained something precious, an understanding of human resilience that few people ever acquire. They had learned that dignity could be maintained even in the most degrading circumstances. They had discovered that community could be created even among strangers. They had proven that hope could survive even in the darkest times. The Hong Kong Christmas of 1941 marked the end of an era of British confidence and the beginning of a new understanding of vulnerability. But the courage and resilience of the civilians who endured nearly 4 years of internment demonstrated that the human spirit could triumph even over the most systematic attempts to crush it. While Malta was enduring its siege and Singapore was falling to Japanese forces, another British territory was facing a different kind of crisis, one that would tear apart families and communities in ways that military action never could. Gibraltar, the famous rock that had guarded the entrance to the Mediterranean for over 2 centuries, was about to experience the most traumatic event in its modern history. Gibraltar in 1940 was a unique place, a tiny peninsula of just 2.6 square miles that was home to 21,000 civilians, representing one of the most diverse communities in the British Empire. There were British families whose ancestors had arrived with the original garrison in 1704. There were Spanish workers who crossed the border daily from La Linea. There were Genoese merchants whose families had traded in the Mediterranean for generations. There were Maltese stonemasons, Jewish refugees from Morocco, and Indian merchants who had made the Rock their home. This was a community that had developed its own unique culture over more than 2 centuries. They spoke a distinctive dialect called Llanito that blended English, Spanish, Arabic, and Italian. They celebrated both British and Spanish holidays. They had survived the Great Siege of 1779 to 1783, when Spanish and French forces had tried unsuccessfully to starve them into submission. They considered themselves Gibraltarians first, British second, and they were fiercely proud of their rock. The strategic importance of Gibraltar was obvious to everyone. The rock controlled the narrow strait between Europe and Africa, the only entrance to the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. Every ship passing between the Mediterranean and the outside world had to pass under Gibraltar's guns. In wartime, this made the territory invaluable and extremely vulnerable. As the war in Europe intensified and France fell to German forces in June 1940, British military planners became increasingly concerned about Gibraltar's security. Intelligence reports suggested that Germany was pressuring Spain to enter the war on the Axis side. If Spanish forces attacked Gibraltar from the land side while German aircraft bombed from the air, the Rock's civilian population would be trapped in a death trap. The decision when it came was swift and brutal. On July 16, 1940, the British government announced that all civilians except essential workers would be evacuated from Gibraltar within 48 hours. Families that had lived on the Rock for generations were given 2 days to pack their entire lives into a single suitcase and leave their homeland, possibly forever. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Maria Montegrifo was 8 years old when the evacuation order came. Decades later, she could still remember the chaos and confusion of those final hours. My grandmother had lived on the Rock for 70 years. She had survived the cholera epidemic of 1865, the yellow fever outbreak of 1828, and the Great War when German submarines prowled just outside the harbor. She had never lived anywhere else, never wanted to live anywhere else. When the soldiers came to tell us we had to leave, she sat in her chair and refused to move. "I was born on this rock," she said, "and I will die on this rock, but they made her go anyway." I remember her crying as we boarded the ship, saying over and over, "We'll never see Gibraltar again." She was right. She died in London during the Blitz, never knowing if her home still existed. The evacuation was a logistical nightmare. Ships had to be found to transport 16,000 people to destinations across the British Empire. Families had to be housed, fed, and cared for in countries they had never seen. Children had to be enrolled in schools where they didn't speak the language. Adults had to find work in economies they didn't understand. The destinations were scattered across the globe, determined more by available shipping than by any consideration of what might be best for the evacuees. Some families were sent to London, where they would face the Blitz in underground shelters while worrying about their abandoned homes. Others were shipped to Jamaica, where the tropical climate and unfamiliar culture created new challenges. Some went to Madeira, others to Northern Ireland, still others to camps in Morocco. The most heartbreaking aspect of the evacuation was the separation of families. The ships couldn't accommodate everyone at once, so families were often split up, with different members sent to different destinations. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children, siblings from each other. Some families wouldn't be reunited for over a decade. The Bossano family exemplified the tragedy of separation. Juan Bossano, a dock worker, was classified as essential and had to remain in Gibraltar. His wife Carmen and their 3 children were evacuated to London. For 5 years they lived in different worlds, he on the Rock, enduring air raids and military restrictions, she in London struggling to raise 3 children alone while German bombs fell on the city. Their youngest daughter was 2 when they were separated and 7 when they were finally reunited. She had no memory of her father and spoke with a London accent he could barely understand. Meanwhile, Gibraltar itself was transformed into a fortress, unlike anything seen before. The Rock was honeycombed with tunnels, eventually 34 miles of passages carved from solid limestone. These weren't just military installations, but an entire underground city complete with hospitals, ammunition stores, vehicle parks, and living quarters for the 30,000 troops who now garrisoned the territory. The few hundred civilians who remained, essential workers like dock laborers, telephone operators, and medical staff, found themselves living in a surreal world. The familiar streets of their hometown were now filled with soldiers from a dozen different countries. Anti-aircraft guns sprouted from every available rooftop. Barbed wire blocked roads they had walked since childhood. The civilian community that had given Gibraltar its character had virtually disappeared. James Howes, a British engineer who remained on the Rock throughout the war, described the transformation in his memoirs. Gibraltar became a military machine, nothing more. The shops were closed, the schools empty, the churches silent except for military services. We lived and worked underground like moles in a limestone warren. My office was 150 feet inside solid rock, connected to the outside world only by telephone cables and ventilation shafts. Sometimes I would forget what day it was, what season, whether it was raining or sunny outside. The only way you knew there was a war on was when the lights flickered during air raids, or when the Rock shook from the blast of our own guns firing at enemy aircraft. The air raids on Gibraltar were less intense than those on Malta, but they were constant reminders that the Rock was very much on the front line. German and Italian aircraft based in North Africa and southern France made regular attacks on the harbour and airfield. The raids were usually small, a few bombers escorted by fighters, but they kept everyone on edge. The Spanish workers who had crossed the border daily before the war found themselves in an impossible situation. Spain remained officially neutral, but Spanish workers continued to be employed in Gibraltar's docks and military installations. These men lived in Spanish territory, but worked for the British war effort. They were caught between competing loyalties, never knowing whether Spain might enter the war and make them enemies of their employers. The psychological impact on the evacuated civilians was profound and lasting. They were refugees in their own empire, displaced persons who had committed no crime except living in a strategically important location. Many struggled with depression, anxiety, and a sense of rootlessness that would affect them for years. Children faced particular challenges. Those evacuated to London found themselves in a city under attack, trading one war zone for another. Those sent to tropical colonies struggled with unfamiliar climates, diseases, and cultures. Many lost their ability to speak Lanito, the distinctive Gibraltar dialect, and found themselves culturally adrift. The evacuation also created unexpected opportunities. Some Gibraltarians discovered talents and abilities they never knew they possessed. Women who had never worked outside the home found themselves in factories and offices. Men who had been dock workers became skilled technicians. Children who had attended small local schools found themselves in prestigious institutions that opened new possibilities for their futures. But for most evacuees, the dominant emotion was homesickness, a deep, aching longing for the Rock that had been their world. They formed Gibraltar associations in their new homes, gathering to speak Lanito, cook traditional foods, and share memories of the homeland they had been forced to leave. The return of Gibraltar's civilians began in 1944, but it was a slow and complicated process. The Rock had been transformed by 4 years of military occupation. Many houses had been requisitioned by the military and were still occupied by troops. The infrastructure had been damaged by bombing and neglect. The economy had to be rebuilt from scratch. More challenging was the psychological adjustment. Families that had been separated for years had to learn to live together again. Children who had left as toddlers returned as teenagers, speaking with foreign accents and unfamiliar customs. Parents had aged and changed. The community that had existed before the war could never be fully restored. Some evacuees chose never to return. They had built new lives in London, Jamaica, or other destinations, and saw no reason to go back to a rock that had rejected them. Others returned, but found that Gibraltar was no longer the home they remembered. The unique culture that had developed over centuries had been disrupted, perhaps permanently. The last evacuees didn't return until 1951, 11 years after they had been forced to leave. By then, an entire generation had grown up in exile. The Gibraltar they returned to was more prosperous and modern than the one they had left, but it was also more British and less distinctively Gibraltarian. The evacuation of Gibraltar was unique in British wartime experience, the only time an entire civilian population was forcibly removed from British territory for military reasons. It was done with the best of intentions to protect civilians from what seemed like inevitable attack. But the human cost was enormous and lasting. The experience taught painful lessons about the relationship between military necessity and civilian rights. It demonstrated that sometimes the cure could be as traumatic as the disease. It showed that communities, once broken apart, could never be perfectly reassembled. Yet it also revealed the resilience of the human spirit. Gibraltarian families survived separation, exile, and cultural displacement. They maintained their identity and their connections to each other across thousands of miles and many years. They rebuilt their community, even if it could never be exactly what it had been before. The Rock of Gibraltar survived the war intact, its strategic value proven and its defenses strengthened. But the human community that had given it life and character was forever changed by the trauma of evacuation and exile. As we reach the end of our journey through these forgotten stories, it's important to understand what these experiences meant, not just for the individuals who lived through them, but for our understanding of World War II and the nature of civilian courage under extreme circumstances. The stories we've explored today, Malta's siege, Singapore's fall, Hong Kong's Christmas, and Gibraltar's evacuation, represent just a fraction of the civilian experience in Britain's overseas territories during the war. From the Arctic convoys that supplied Murmansk to the Burma railway that claimed thousands of civilian lives, from the internment camps of the Dutch East Indies to the bombing of Darwin, British and Commonwealth civilians faced dangers and hardships that matched anything experienced on the home front. What emerges from these stories is a picture of ordinary people displaying extraordinary courage. These weren't professional soldiers trained for combat. They were teachers and shopkeepers, housewives and civil servants, children and grandparents who found themselves on the front lines of a global war through no choice of their own. Their responses to these challenges reveal something profound about human nature. When faced with bombing, siege, internment, or exile, they didn't simply endure. They adapted, they resisted, they maintained their humanity and dignity under the most adverse circumstances. They created schools in bomb shelters, staged concerts in prison camps, and maintained hope when hope seemed impossible. These stories also reveal the true global nature of World War II. This wasn't just a European conflict that spread to other continents. It was a genuinely worldwide struggle that affected every corner of the British Empire and beyond. The war came to tropical islands and Arctic territories, to ancient fortresses and modern cities, to places that had seemed safely remote from the conflicts of Europe. The legacy of these experiences continues to shape our world today. The communities that survived these ordeals were forever changed by them. The lessons learned about resilience, community, and human dignity under pressure remain relevant in our own troubled times. Perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that history is made not just by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The courage of a Maltese family in an underground shelter, the dignity of internees in a Hong Kong prison camp, the resilience of evacuees scattered across the globe. These are the human stories that give meaning to the grand narratives of military and political history. As we remember World War II, we must remember not just the famous battles and the great leaders, but also the millions of civilians who faced their own battles on the other front lines of a global conflict. Their stories deserve to be told, their courage deserves to be remembered, and their legacy deserves to be honored. The war ended over 75 years ago, but the lessons of these civilian experiences remain as relevant as ever. In a world that still faces conflicts, displacement, and humanitarian crises, The stories of Malta's siege, Singapore's fall, Hong Kong's Christmas, and Gibraltar's evacuation remind us of both the worst and the best of human nature. The capacity for cruelty and the capacity for courage, the power to destroy and the power to endure. These were Britain's other front lines, and the people who defended them with nothing but their courage and their humanity deserve their place in history alongside any military hero. Their stories are our stories, their courage is our inheritance, and their legacy is our responsibility to preserve and honor.